Officer Tom Riley squinted against the setting sun as he pulled up to the Victorian-style house. Scaffolding clung to its weathered facade, and the yard was littered with construction debris. A neighbor's call about a suspicious person had brought him here, just 2 hours before his shift ended. Tom's hand rested on his holster as he approached the property. 28 years on the force had honed his instincts, and something felt off. Movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from the shadows of the porch. "Police, don't move," Tom barked, drawing his weapon. The man froze, hands raised. He was black, early 40s, wearing paint-splattered jeans and a faded t-shirt. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding." "Shut it," Tom snapped, closing the distance. "Turn around, hands on your head." The man complied, his muscles tense as Tom patted him down. No weapons. "What are you doing here?" Tom demanded, cuffing the man's wrists. "I own this house. I'm renovating it." Tom scoffed. "Yeah, right. ID?" "Back pocket, wallet." Tom retrieved it, flipping it open. Marcus Davis, the address matched. "Could be stolen," Tom muttered, pocketing the wallet. "You're coming with me." As Tom led Marcus to the patrol car, a voice called out from across the street. "Hey, what's going on?" Tom turned to see an elderly white woman hurrying towards them, concern etched on her face. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is police business," Tom said, his voice authoritative. The woman, undeterred, came closer. "But that's Mr. Davis. He bought this house a few months ago. He's been working on it ever since." Tom's grip on Marcus's arm tightened. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I need to verify his identity. Please return to your home." The woman looked uncertainly between Tom and Marcus, then slowly retreated to her porch, still watching. Tom opened the back door of the patrol car. "Get in," he ordered Marcus. As Marcus ducked his head to enter the car, he locked eyes with Tom. "Officer, I'm telling you, this is a mistake. I can prove—" Tom slammed the door, cutting him off. He circled around to the driver's side, ignoring the prickling doubt at the back of his neck. The neighbor's words echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside. He'd seen too many criminals try to talk their way out of arrests. Better to sort it out at the station. The drive to the precinct was tense and silent. Tom glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, seeing Marcus sitting stoically in the back seat. The man's calm demeanor unsettled Tom more than if he'd been angry or protesting. At the station, Tom led Marcus to a holding cell, ignoring the man's repeated attempts to explain. He'd seen it all before. Excuses, lies, anything to avoid consequences. "Sit tight," Tom grunted, slamming the cell door. He headed to his desk, Marcus's wallet heavy in his pocket. Something nagged at him, a doubt he couldn't shake. With a sigh, he opened his computer and began to dig. 30 minutes later, Tom's world tilted on its axis. Marcus Davis, renowned architect, recent purchaser of 1420 Elm Street, the very house Tom had arrested him at. Tom's stomach churned as he scrolled through articles praising Davis's work in historic preservation. "Shit," Tom muttered, running a hand over his thinning hair. He stood, legs unsteady, and made his way back to the holding cell. Marcus sat on the bench, eyes closed, breathing measured. "Mr. Davis," Tom said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I owe you an apology." Marcus's eyes snapped open, fixing Tom with a steady gaze. "Do you?" Tom swallowed hard. "I made assumptions, jumped to conclusions. It was unprofessional and wrong." "It was more than unprofessional, Officer Riley," Marcus said, standing. "It was dangerous. It was prejudiced. And it happens far too often." Tom felt the weight of his badge, suddenly heavy on his chest. "I'm releasing you immediately. No charges." As Tom unlocked the cell, the full impact of his actions crashed over him. This man, this accomplished professional, could have been seriously hurt, or worse. All because Tom saw a black man and assumed criminal. "Mr. Davis," Tom said, his voice low, "I can't undo what happened, but I promise you this won't be swept under the rug. I'll be filing a full report. On myself." Marcus nodded, his expression grave. "See that you do, officer, because next time it might not end with just an apology." As Marcus walked away, Tom stood rooted to the spot, the echoes of his actions reverberating through the empty corridor. He had a long night ahead, and an even longer journey of self-reflection to begin. Tom watched Marcus disappear around the corner, then slowly made his way back to his desk. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making each step feel like a mile. As he sank into his chair, the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. He'd arrested an innocent man, not just innocent, but a respected professional. And he'd done it based on nothing more than the color of his skin and his own prejudiced assumptions. Tom opened a new incident report on his computer, his fingers hovering over the keys. How could he possibly explain this? How could he justify his actions even to himself? As he began to type, Tom realized that this report wouldn't just be about tonight's incident. It would be about years of unchecked biases, of assumptions he'd never questioned, of a system that had allowed, even encouraged, such behavior. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for Tom to begin his confession. The precinct buzzed with its usual evening activity, but Tom barely registered it. His eyes were fixed on the computer screen, the incident report glaring back at him. He'd been sitting there for over an hour, the words coming in fits and starts. "Riley, you still here?" Tom looked up to see Captain Laura Bennett standing by his desk, her brow furrowed in concern. "Captain," Tom nodded, straightening in his chair. "I was just finishing up a report." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "At this hour? Must be important." Tom swallowed hard. "It is. It's about an incident earlier today. A wrongful arrest." Bennett's expression hardened. "My office, now." Tom followed her, his legs feeling like lead. As he entered the office, Bennett closed the door behind them. "Sit down, Tom," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, Tom recounted the events of the evening. He didn't spare himself, laying out every assumption, every mistake in excruciating detail. As he spoke, he could see Bennett's expression shifting from concern to disappointment to anger. When he finished, Bennett leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Tom?" "Yes, Captain," Tom replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you?" Bennett's voice was sharp. "Because this isn't just about you. This is about our entire department. Hell, it's about law enforcement as a whole. Every time an officer like you makes a decision based on prejudice, it erodes public trust. It makes our job harder. It puts lives at risk." Tom nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I've known you for 20 years, Tom," Bennett continued, her tone softening slightly. "You're not a bad cop, but this is unacceptable." "I know, Captain," Tom said. "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences." "Consequences?" Bennett interrupted. "Tom, we're way past simple consequences. This requires action, real meaningful change." She stood up, pacing behind her desk. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going on administrative leave, effective immediately. 2 weeks unpaid. During that time, you'll undergo intensive bias training. And when you come back, you'll be on probation for 6 months." Tom nodded, accepting the punishment without argument. "But that's not all," Bennett continued. "I want you to reach out to Mr. Davis, apologize in person, and I want you to work with our community relations team. You're going to be the face of our new initiative on combating racial bias in policing." Tom's head snapped up. "Captain, I don't think I'm the right person for that." "That's exactly why you are the right person, Tom," Bennett said firmly. "You've seen firsthand how these biases can affect your judgment. Who better to speak about it?" Tom sat in stunned silence, the enormity of the task ahead of him sinking in. "One more thing," Bennett added, her voice softening. "I want you to talk to someone. Professional counseling. This isn't just about changing behaviors, Tom. It's about understanding why you made those choices in the first place." Tom nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I understand, Captain. Thank you for not firing me outright." Bennett sighed, sitting back down. "Tom, you're a good cop with a solid record. But this incident has shown us that even good cops can make terrible mistakes when they let their biases guide them. Use this as an opportunity to become better, not just as a cop, but as a person." As Tom left Bennett's office, the weight of his actions and the road ahead pressed down on him. He made his way back to his desk, gathering his things. Officers around him cast curious glances, but he ignored them, focused on the task at hand. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed. A text from his daughter, Sarah. "Dad, saw on the news about a wrongful arrest at that old Victorian on Elm. That wasn't you, was it?" Tom's heart sank. Of course it would be on the news already. He typed out a reply with shaking fingers. "We need to talk. I'll be home soon." The drive home was a blur, Tom's mind racing with how he would explain this to his family. As he pulled into the driveway of his modest suburban home, he saw Sarah waiting on the porch, her arms crossed. At 25, Sarah had always been his fiercest critic and strongest supporter. The disappointment in her eyes as he approached cut him to the core. "Dad," she said, her voice tight, "tell me it's not true." Tom couldn't meet her gaze. "Sarah, How could you?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "After everything we've talked about, after all the protests I've been to, After everything that's happened in the past few years, how could you still make a mistake like this? Tom felt the weight of her words, each one a blow to his already battered conscience. I don't have an excuse, Sarah. I messed up. Badly. Sarah's expression softened slightly at the defeat in her father's voice. Come inside, Dad. We need to talk about this. As they entered the house, Tom braced himself for one of the most difficult conversations of his life. He knew that rebuilding trust, with his daughter, with the community, with himself, would be a long and painful process. But as he looked at Sarah, saw the mix of disappointment and hope in her eyes, he knew it was a process he had to commit to. For her, for Marcus Davis, for every person who had ever been wrongly judged based on the color of their skin. Tom took a deep breath and followed his daughter into the living room, ready to begin the hard work of change. The next morning, Tom sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee. Sleep had eluded him, his mind replaying the events of the previous day in an endless loop. The conversation with Sarah had been difficult, filled with tears and hard truths. She'd forced him to confront aspects of himself he'd long ignored or denied. Morning, Dad. Sarah's voice broke through his reverie. She stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of concern and lingering disappointment. Morning, sweetheart, Tom replied, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. So, what's your plan? Tom sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Captain Bennett's got me on administrative leave for 2 weeks. I've got to undergo bias training, and when I get back, I'll be on probation. Sarah nodded, her face serious. That's a start. But what about you, Dad? What are you going to do to change? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Tom stared into his coffee, searching for an answer. I don't know, Sarah, he admitted finally. I've been a cop for almost 30 years. I thought I was one of the good ones, but now you realize that being one of the good ones isn't enough, Sarah finished for him. Tom nodded, feeling the truth of her words. I need to do better, be better, but I don't know how. Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand. It starts with listening, Dad. Really listening. To the people you've hurt. To the communities you've sworn to protect. And then it's about action. Real, meaningful action. Tom squeezed her hand, grateful for her wisdom and her willingness to help him through this. You're right. I think I need to start with Mr. Davis. I owe him a real apology. That's a good start, Sarah agreed. But remember, it's not about making yourself feel better. It's about acknowledging the harm you've caused and committing to do better. Tom nodded, feeling a spark of determination ignite within him. I understand. Thank you, Sarah, for not giving up on me. Sarah's expression softened. You're my dad. I love you. But loving you means holding you accountable too. As Sarah left for work, Tom found himself alone with his thoughts once more. He pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before opening his contacts. He scrolled until he found the number he was looking for, Marcus Davis. Tom's finger hovered over the call button, his heart racing. What would he say? How could he possibly make this right? But he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, he pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Tom was about to hang up when a voice answered. Hello? Marcus's tone was guarded, wary. Mr. Davis, Tom said, his voice shaking slightly. This is Officer Riley. I was hoping we could talk, in person if you're willing. There was a long pause, and Tom feared Marcus might hang up. Finally, Marcus spoke. Officer Riley, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that conversation yet. Tom felt his heart sink, but he pressed on. I understand, Mr. Davis. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I want to apologize properly, face to face. And more than that, I want to listen, to understand how my actions affected you and what I can do to make amends. Another pause, this one even longer. All right, Officer Riley, I'll meet with you, but not at the station. There's a coffee shop on Main Street, the Daily Grind. Meet me there at 2 p.m. Thank you, Mr. Davis. I'll be there. As Tom hung up, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had a chance to make things right, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The hours until the meeting crawled by. Tom spent them researching, reading articles about racial bias in policing, watching videos of Black Americans sharing their experiences with law enforcement. Each story, each statistic felt like a blow to his conscience. How had he been so blind for so long? At 1:45, Tom arrived at the Daily Grind. He chose a table near the back, away from the windows. As he waited, he couldn't help but notice the looks he was getting from other patrons. News of the incident had clearly spread. At precisely 2 p.m., Marcus Davis walked in. He spotted Tom immediately, his expression unreadable as he approached the table. "Mr. Davis," Tom said, standing. "Thank you for coming." Marcus nodded, taking a seat across from Tom. "I'm here, Officer Riley. Say what you need to say." Tom took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "First, I want to apologize. What I did was wrong, inexcusable. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I caused you harm in the process. I'm deeply, truly sorry." Marcus listened, his expression unchanging. When Tom finished, he leaned forward slightly. "Officer Riley, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand something. What happened to me? It's not an isolated incident. It's not just about you or me. It's about a system that allows these biases to persist, that trains officers to see people who look like me as threats first and citizens second." Tom nodded, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. "I understand, or at least I'm trying to. That's why I'm here. I want to listen, to learn. I want to understand how I can do better, how I can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Marcus studied Tom for a long moment as if gauging his sincerity. Finally, he spoke. "All right, Officer Riley, let's talk. But understand this conversation is just the beginning. Real change takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Are you ready for that?" Tom met Marcus's gaze, feeling the full weight of the challenge before him. "Yes, Mr. Davis, I'm ready." As they began to talk, Tom realized that this conversation was more than just an apology or an attempt at personal growth. It was the start of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his job, and the world around him. The coffee shop hummed with afternoon activity, but for Tom and Marcus, the world had narrowed to their small table in the corner. Steam rose from their untouched cups as they faced each other, the weight of their conversation palpable in the air between them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on Tom. "Tell me, Officer Riley, before that day, had you ever stopped to consider how your actions might be influenced by racial bias?" Tom felt the instinctive urge to defend himself rise up, but he pushed it down. He'd promised to listen, to learn. "Honestly, no," he admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I always told myself I treated everyone equally, that I was colorblind." A wry smile touched Marcus's lips. "Colorblind. That's a dangerous word, Officer Riley. It implies that you don't see race, which means you also don't see the unique challenges and experiences that come with being a person of color in this country." Tom nodded slowly, feeling the truth of Marcus's words settle uncomfortably in his chest. "I'm starting to understand that now, but how do I move forward from here? How do I change years of ingrained thinking?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "It starts with acknowledgement. You've taken that first step by admitting your bias. Now comes the hard part, actively working to change it." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "Let me ask you this. When you approached me that day, what was the first thing that went through your mind?" Tom felt his face flush with shame, but he forced himself to answer honestly. "I saw a black man in a neighborhood where I didn't think he belonged. I assumed you were there to cause trouble." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "And if I had been white?" The question hit Tom like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, the realization dawning on him. "I probably wouldn't have even stopped," he admitted quietly. "Exactly," Marcus said. "That's what we're up against, Officer Riley. It's not just about individual actions. It's about a system that's trained you, trained all of us, to see black people as inherently suspicious." Tom felt the weight of Marcus's words settle on him. "How do we change that?" "It's not easy," Marcus replied. "It takes constant vigilance. You have to question your assumptions, challenge your first impressions. Every time you interact with a person of color, ask yourself, would I be responding this way if they were white?" Tom nodded, trying to absorb Marcus's advice. "I want to do better. I need to do better, but I'm afraid that I'll mess up again, that I'll hurt someone else." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "That fear, use it. Let it remind you to think before you act, to question your instincts. But don't let it paralyze you. Change doesn't happen without discomfort." As their conversation continued, Tom found himself opening up about his career, his upbringing, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways he'd been taught to view race throughout his life. Marcus listened, offering insights and challenging Tom's perceptions at every turn. "You know," Marcus said after a particularly intense exchange, I didn't want to meet with you at first. I've had too many experiences with well-meaning white people who want absolution more than they want actual change. Tom felt a flash of defensiveness, but he pushed it aside. What changed your mind? Marcus studied him for a moment. The way you approached me. You didn't ask for forgiveness. You asked to listen, to understand. That's rare, Officer Riley. It made me think that maybe, just maybe, you were serious about change. Tom felt a glimmer of hope at Marcus's words. I am serious. I know I have a long way to go, but I want to be part of the solution. I don't know where to start. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. Start with yourself. Educate yourself about the history of racial injustice in this country. Listen to the experiences of people of color, and then use your position to make a difference. You're a police officer. You have the power to influence how your colleagues interact with the community. Tom nodded, feeling a sense of purpose beginning to take root. Captain Bennett wants me to work with our community relations team when I get back from leave, to be part of an initiative on combating racial bias in policing. That's a start, Marcus agreed. But remember, it's not just about programs or initiatives. It's about changing the culture from within. It's about speaking up when you see a colleague acting on bias, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about being willing to have hard conversations like this one every single day. As their conversation drew to a close, Tom felt both exhausted and invigorated. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time since the incident, he felt like he had a map to follow. Mr. Davis, Tom said as they stood to leave, I can't thank you enough for this, for your willingness to talk, to help me understand. Marcus held out his hand. Don't thank me, Officer Riley. Show me. Show me through your actions that this conversation meant something. That's the only thanks I need. Tom shook Marcus's hand, feeling the weight of the promise in that handshake. I will. I swear it. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Tom watched Marcus walk away, his mind reeling from their conversation. He knew that this was just the beginning, that he had years of unlearning and relearning ahead of him. But as he turned towards home, Tom felt a sense of determination settle over him. He had been given a chance to do better, to be better, and he was going to make the most of it, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. A week into his administrative leave, Tom found himself sitting in a sterile conference room at the police academy. Around him, a dozen other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, all there for the same reason: mandatory bias training. At the front of the room stood Dr. Amelia Chen, a renowned expert in implicit bias and police reform. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the mix of defiance, skepticism, and resignation on the officers' faces. Good morning, officers, Dr. Chen began, her voice firm but not unkind. I know many of you are here because you have to be, but I want you to approach this training with an open mind. What you learn here could save lives, including your own. Tom sat up straighter, his conversation with Marcus still fresh in his mind. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity. Dr. Chen clicked to the first slide of her presentation. Let's start with a simple exercise. I'm going to show you a series of faces. I want you to press the button in front of you if you think the person looks threatening. Don't overthink it. Just go with your gut instinct. As the faces flashed on the screen, Tom found his finger hovering over the button. He pressed it a few times, then stopped, a sinking feeling in his stomach as he realized what he was doing. When the exercise ended, Dr. Chen pulled up a graph of the results. As you can see, the faces you collectively identified as threatening were predominantly young men of color, yet statistically, they're no more likely to be criminals than anyone else. A murmur ran through the room. Tom heard one of the officers behind him mutter, "This is bullshit." Dr. Chen, seemingly unfazed, continued, "This is what we call implicit bias. It's not about being racist. It's about the unconscious associations we've all been conditioned to make. The key is recognizing these biases and learning to counteract them." As the day progressed, Tom found himself increasingly engaged. They discussed real-world scenarios, analyzed body cam footage, and practiced de-escalation techniques. With each exercise, Tom couldn't help but think of his encounter with Marcus, seeing it through new eyes. During a break, Tom found himself standing next to Officer Jake Miller, a younger cop he knew from the precinct. "Can you believe this crap?" Jake muttered, shaking his head. "Like we don't have enough to worry about on the job without second-guessing every decision." Tom felt a flash of his old self in Jake's words, the defensiveness, the resistance to change. But now, he saw it differently. "You know, Jake," Tom said carefully, I used to think like that, but I've realized that this isn't about making our job harder. It's about making it better, for us and for the community we serve. Jake looked at him skeptically. Since when did you become such a believer, Riley? This about that wrongful arrest last week? Tom nodded, feeling a mix of shame and determination. Yeah, it is. It opened my eyes to a lot of things, made me realize I need to do better. Before Jake could respond, Dr. Chen called them back to their seats. The afternoon session focused on community engagement and building trust. The communities you serve, especially communities of color, need to see you as allies, not occupying forces, Dr. Chen explained. This means being present when there isn't a crisis. It means listening to concerns, even when they're uncomfortable to hear. As she spoke, Tom found himself thinking about the upcoming Community Relations Initiative. He started jotting down ideas, his mind racing with possibilities. At the end of the day, as the other officers filed out, Tom approached Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen, I was wondering if I could ask you something. She looked up from packing her materials, her expression curious. Of course, officer. Riley, Tom Riley. He took a deep breath. I'm part of a new initiative at my precinct, focusing on improving community relations and addressing bias. I was wondering if you had any advice on how to make it truly effective. Dr. Chen studied him for a moment, seeming to gauge his sincerity. Officer Riley, the fact that you're asking this question is a good start. My advice? Make sure it's not just a PR exercise. Involve the community in the planning process. Listen to their concerns and be willing to make real changes based on their input. Tom nodded, feeling both overwhelmed and inspired. Thank you, Dr. Chen. I appreciate your time. As he left the academy, Tom's mind was buzzing with everything he'd learned. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah's number. Hey, Dad, she answered. How was the training? It was eye-opening, Tom replied. Listen, I was thinking, you're involved with some local advocacy groups, right? I was wondering if you could put me in touch with some of the organizers. I want to get their input on this community relations initiative. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was filled with a mix of surprise and pride. Yeah, Dad, I can do that. I'm really glad you're taking this seriously. Me too, sweetheart, Tom said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Me too. As he drove home, Tom reflected on how much had changed in just a week. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The training had given him tools, but it was up to him to use them, to question his assumptions, to listen more than he spoke, to be an agent of change within his department. Tom made a mental note to reach out to Marcus again, to share what he'd learned, and to seek more guidance. This journey was just beginning, but Tom was committed to seeing it through, no matter how challenging it might be. 2 weeks had passed, and Tom found himself back at the precinct, standing nervously outside Captain Bennett's office. His administrative leave was over, but the real work was just beginning. He took a deep breath and knocked. Come in, Riley, Bennett called out. Tom entered, noticing the subtle changes in the office. A new poster about community policing hung on the wall, and several books on racial justice were prominently displayed on the bookshelf. Have a seat, Bennett said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. How are you feeling about being back? Tom sat down, his posture straight but tense. Ready to make some changes, Captain. The training was enlightening, and I've been doing a lot of thinking and research on my own. Bennett nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. Good, because we've got a lot of work ahead of us. This isn't just about making our lives easier, Marcus concluded. It's about making your job safer. When the community trusts the police, everyone benefits. As the presentation ended, the room erupted into discussion. Some officers approached Tom and Marcus with questions, while others huddled in corners, debating amongst themselves. Officer Donovan approached, his expression thoughtful. Riley, I've got to admit I was skeptical, still am about some of this, but I can see why it matters. Maybe I've been looking at this the wrong way. Tom felt a glimmer of hope. I appreciate that, Mike, and I get it, I really do. This is a big change for all of us, but I truly believe it's necessary. As the officers filed out, Captain Bennett approached Tom and Marcus. Well done, both of you. I think you've given them a lot to think about. Marcus nodded, a small smile on his face. It's a start. There's still a long way to go, but this is how progress happens. One conversation at a time. Tom looked around the room, at the small groups of officers still deep in discussion. He knew they hadn't won everyone over, not yet, but they'd made a start. They'd opened a dialogue. As he packed up his materials, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly making headway. The resistance wasn't gone, but it was weakening, and in its place, a new understanding was beginning to take root. 6 months into the initiative, progress was steady but slow. The department had seen improvements in community relations, but tension still simmered beneath the surface. Then, on a sweltering summer afternoon, everything threatened to unravel. Tom was in his office when the call came in. A police shooting in a predominantly black neighborhood. The details were sketchy, but the situation was volatile. Crowds were gathering, anger was rising, and the specter of past injustices loomed large. Captain Bennett burst into Tom's office, her face grim. "Riley, we've got a situation. Officer-involved shooting on Maple Street. It's bad." Tom felt his heart sink. How bad? Teenage victim, unarmed. Officer claims he thought the kid had a gun. Bennett's voice was tight with tension. "We need to get ahead of this, fast." Tom nodded, already reaching for his jacket. "I'm on it. What do we know about the officer involved?" "It's Miller, Jake Miller." The name hit Tom like a punch to the gut. Jake had been one of the most resistant to the changes, always skating the edge of insubordination. And now this. As Tom and Bennett raced to the scene, the streets were a blur of flashing lights and gathering crowds. They could hear chants in the distance, growing louder as they approached. "No justice, no peace, no racist police." The scene was chaos. A police cordon struggled to hold back an angry crowd. News vans were arriving, cameras already rolling, and in the center of it all, a small body lay covered by a sheet, a grieving mother wailing nearby. Tom felt a wave of nausea hit him. This was everything they'd been working to prevent, everything they promised the community wouldn't happen again. Bennett turned to him, her voice low and urgent. "We need to de-escalate this situation now, Riley. You've built relationships in this community. Use them." Tom nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He approached the police line, gesturing for the officers to let him through. As he stepped towards the crowd, he recognized faces from community meetings, people he'd spoken with, listened to. "Folks, please," Tom called out, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but please, let's talk about this." "Talk?" A voice rang out from the crowd. "We're done talking. You promised changes, and now our children are still dying." Tom recognized the speaker, Michael Johnson, a community leader he'd worked closely with over the past months. The betrayal in Michael's eyes cut deep. "Michael," Tom said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "I know I've let you down. We've let you down, but please give me a chance to make this right." Michael pushed through the crowd, standing face to face with Tom. "How, Officer Riley? How can you possibly make this right?" Tom met Michael's gaze, unflinching. "Full transparency, an independent investigation. And I promise you, if wrongdoing is found, there will be consequences." The crowd had quieted, listening intently to the exchange. "We've heard promises before," Michael said, his voice bitter. "Then don't take my word for it," Tom replied. "Be part of the process. We'll form a community oversight committee right now. You and anyone else who wants to be involved will have full access to the investigation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Tom could see uncertainty replacing some of the anger in their eyes. Michael studied Tom for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Riley, we'll do it your way. But know this, if we smell even a hint of a cover-up, this whole neighborhood will burn." Tom nodded solemnly. "I understand. Thank you for giving us this chance." As Michael turned to address the crowd, explaining the plan, Tom felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Captain Bennett. "Bold move, Riley," she said, her expression a mix of approval and concern. "You sure about this?" Tom nodded. "It's the only way, Captain. We can't ask for their trust if we're not willing to be completely open." Over the next few hours, Tom worked tirelessly to set the plan in motion. He coordinated with community leaders to form the oversight committee, arranged for an independent investigator, and ensured that every step of the process would be transparent and accessible to the public. As night fell, the crowd had dispersed, but the tension in the air remained. Tom stood at the edge of the crime scene, watching as forensics teams worked under the harsh glare of floodlights. He felt someone approach and turned to see Marcus Davis standing beside him. "I heard what happened," Marcus said quietly. "And what you did?" Tom sighed heavily. "I just hope it's enough. We've worked so hard these past months, and now, Marcus placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. This was always a possibility, Tom. Change doesn't happen overnight. What matters is how we respond to setbacks like this. Tom nodded, grateful for Marcus's steady presence. You're right. But God, Marcus, a kid is dead. How do we come back from that? We don't come back, Marcus replied, his voice firm. We move forward. We use this tragedy as a catalyst for even greater change. We make sure that young man's death wasn't in vain. As they stood there watching the scene unfold, Tom felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew the coming days and weeks would be a crucial test of everything they'd worked for. The community's trust hung by a thread. The department was under scrutiny like never before. And somewhere out there, a family was grieving a loss that could never be made right. Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. This crisis could undo everything they'd accomplished, or it could be the turning point they needed to push for real, lasting change. As he turned to head back to the precinct, Tom made a silent vow. He would see this through, no matter the cost. For the sake of the community, for the future of the department, and for that young life cut tragically short, he would not rest until justice was served and real change was achieved. The weeks following the shooting were a blur of activity, tension, and relentless scrutiny. Tom found himself at the center of a storm, balancing the demands of the investigation, the expectations of the community, and the fracturing morale within the department. The Community Oversight Committee, led by Michael Johnson, had become a constant presence at the precinct. Their watchful eyes followed every step of the investigation, challenging each decision, each piece of evidence. Tom sat in the conference room, surrounded by committee members, department heads, and the independent investigator. The air was thick with tension as they reviewed the body cam footage for what felt like the 100th time. On the screen, Jake Miller's voice crackled through the speakers. "Show me your hands, now!" The grainy image showed a young man barely more than a boy turning suddenly. A glint of metal, a cell phone they now knew, and then the deafening sound of gunshots. Tom forced himself to watch even as his stomach churned. He owed it to the victim, to the community, to bear witness to this tragedy. As the video ended, silence fell over the room. It was Michael who broke it, his voice tight with controlled anger. Officer Miller had no justification for using deadly force. This was murder, plain and simple. Tom took a deep breath before responding. The evidence certainly points to an unjustified use of force, but we need to let the investigation run its course. Run its course? Another committee member scoffed. How much more evidence do you need? Before Tom could respond, Captain Bennett interjected. We understand your frustration, but we have to follow due process. If we don't, any actions we take could be overturned on appeal. The meeting continued, voices rising and falling as they debated next steps. Tom felt the weight of each word, each decision. He knew that whatever happened next would define not just this case, but the future of police-community relations in their city. As the meeting adjourned, Tom found himself face to face with Michael. The community leader's eyes were hard, challenging. You promised us justice, Riley, Michael said, his voice low. The community is watching. Don't let us down again. Tom nodded, feeling the weight of that promise. I won't, Michael. Whatever the outcome, we'll face it together. Later that evening, Tom sat in his office, poring over reports and witness statements. A knock at the door interrupted his focus. He looked up to see Jake Miller standing in the doorway, his face haggard and drawn. Got a minute, Riley? Jake's voice was rough, as if he hadn't slept in days, which Tom realized he probably hadn't. Of course, Jake. Come in. Jake slumped into the chair across from Tom's desk. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on his hands. I screwed up, Tom, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw that kid turn, saw something in his hand, and I just reacted. I was scared. And now a kid is dead because of me. Tom felt a mix of sympathy and frustration wash over him. Jake, I can't discuss the details of the investigation with you. You know that. Jake nodded, still not meeting Tom's eyes. I know, I don't know how to live with this. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Tom leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. Jake, what happened that night was a tragedy, but hiding from it won't help. You need to be prepared to face the consequences of your actions. Jake finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. What am I supposed to do, Tom? Turn in my badge? Go to jail? How does that help anyone? It's not about helping anyone, Jake. It's about accountability. It's about showing the community that no one is above the law, especially not those sworn to uphold it. Jake nodded slowly, the fight seeming to drain out of him. You're right. I think I'm ready to make a full statement, to tell the truth about what happened that night. Tom felt a glimmer of hope at Jake's words. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could truly redeem the loss of a young life, but it was a step towards accountability. The next morning, Tom stood before a sea of cameras and microphones, the eyes of the entire city upon him. To his left stood Captain Bennett, to his right, Michael Johnson and the other members of the Community Oversight Committee. Good morning, Tom began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. We're here today to announce the findings of our investigation into the shooting of Jamal Thompson. He paused, taking in the tense faces before him. Based on the evidence, including officer testimony and body cam footage, we have concluded that the use of deadly force in this instance was unjustified. A ripple ran through the crowd. Tom pressed on. Officer Jake Miller has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. He has cooperated fully with the investigation and will be turning himself in later today. The announcement was met with a mix of reactions, cries of vindication from some, shock from others. Tom raised his hands, calling for quiet. This is not a moment for celebration, he continued. A young man has lost his life, a family is grieving, and our community is in pain. But it is my hope that this decision shows our commitment to justice and accountability. As Tom stepped back from the microphone, allowing Michael to speak next, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that the truth had come out, that justice was being served, but there was also a deep sadness for all that had been lost, a young life, a police career, and the trust of a community. As he watched Michael address the crowd, speaking of healing and the long road ahead, Tom knew that this was not the end, but a new beginning. The real work of rebuilding trust, of transforming the department, of creating true community safety, was just starting. The path forward would not be easy, but for the first time in weeks, Tom felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced this crisis head-on, with transparency and accountability. Now, they had the chance to build something better from the ashes of tragedy. 1 year had passed since the shooting of Jamal Thompson. The city had been through a crucible of pain, anger, and eventually, cautious hope. Tom Riley stood at the podium in the community center, the same place where he had first presented his ideas for change. The room was packed, a mix of police officers, community members, and local leaders. A year ago, Tom began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. We stood at a crossroads. We had a choice to make, continue down the path we'd always taken, or forge a new way forward. It hasn't been easy, but I believe we made the right choice. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Some were familiar. Michael Johnson, now a key advisor to the police department. Captain Bennett, her hair a little grayer but her eyes still sharp. Marcus Davis, a constant source of guidance and support. Others were new young officers fresh from a reimagined training program, community members who had once viewed the police with suspicion, but were now cautiously engaged. We've made mistakes along the way, Tom continued. We've had setbacks and moments of doubt, but we've also seen real progress. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing a graph of community complaints against officers. The line trended sharply downward over the past year. Complaints are down by 50%, Tom explained. But more importantly, when complaints do arise, they're being addressed transparently and fairly. He clicked to the next slide, showing images of police officers engaged in community events, reading to children, participating in neighborhood cleanups, attending local cultural celebrations. Our officers are no longer seen as an occupying force, but as part of the community they serve. We've increased diversity in our ranks, implemented comprehensive de-escalation training, and created a mental health response unit to handle calls that don't require armed intervention. As Tom continued his presentation, he could see the impact of their work reflected in the faces before him. There was still caution, still work to be done, but there was also a sense of pride and possibility that hadn't existed a year ago. When he finished, Michael Johnson took the podium. A year ago, I stood in this room and challenged Officer Riley and the entire police department to do better, to be better. I didn't believe they could do it. Michael paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I've never been happier to be proven wrong. The changes we've seen aren't just cosmetic. They're fundamental shifts in how our community and our police interact. We're not where we need to be yet, but for the first time in my life, I believe we're on the right path. As Michael stepped down, the room erupted into applause. Tom felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Marcus standing beside him. "You've come a long way, Tom," Marcus said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "From the officer who arrested me for being in my own neighborhood to this." Tom felt a flush of shame at the memory, but also a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Marcus. Your guidance, your willingness to engage even after what I did, it made all the difference." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "This work is never finished, Tom. We've made progress, but we can't become complacent." "I know," Tom agreed, "but for the first time I feel like we're really making a difference." As the event wound down, Tom found himself approached by a young officer, fresh out of the academy. "Officer Riley, I just wanted to say, you're the reason I joined the force. I saw what you were doing here, the changes you were making, and I knew I wanted to be part of it." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, officer. Just remember, our job is to serve and protect everyone in our community. Never forget that." The young officer nodded earnestly before being called away by a colleague. As Tom gathered his things to leave, he caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the room. Sarah, his daughter, was standing by the door, a proud smile on her face. She had been his harshest critic and strongest supporter throughout this journey. "Dad," she said as he approached, pulling him into a hug. "That was amazing. I'm so proud of you." Tom hugged her back tightly, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes. "Thanks, sweetheart. I couldn't have done it without you pushing me to be better." As they walked out into the evening air, Tom felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of his badge, once a burden of unexamined authority, now felt like a symbol of responsibility and service. He knew the work wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more moments of doubt. But he also knew that they had laid a foundation for real, lasting change. Tom looked up at the stars, thinking about Jamal Thompson and all the others who had suffered because of a broken system. He made a silent promise to them, to his community, and to himself. He would continue this work, continue pushing for change, continue striving to be better. As he and Sarah walked to their cars, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And for the first time in his career, he felt truly ready to meet them. The journey that had begun with a single misguided arrest had led to a transformation, not just of a department, but of a community and of Tom himself. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was still much work to be done, but it was a new beginning, full of hope and possibility. As Tom drove home, the city lights twinkling around him, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. They had faced their demons, confronted hard truths, and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, police and community united in the pursuit of justice and understanding.